Our British history is rich with tales of wealth and power and all that political nonsense. The glamour of our kings and queens, the jewels and furs and charisma, and all those heads being chopped off. But what about the real people who made everything happen? Rig Boer! I'll discover what they ate. It's a bit dodgy. The challenges they faced. Stuff this for a game of soldiers. And how they built Britain. That's straight as a die. I'm going to uncover the extraordinary lives of some of history's ordinary people. Romans. It's quite a weight on my head, I have to say. Edwardians.
Breathe in, madam, breathe in.
1950s.
Put the needle on the record.
Ooh, really soft brakes, takes ages to stop it. And the Middle Ages. There's the executive model inside the house. Whatever. History from the bottom up. This time, I'm going back to the 1950s. It was a time of optimism as Brits picked themselves up from the Second World War. We had a new young queen and celebrated hopes of a brighter future with the Festival of Britain. When I was a kid in the 1950s, it never occurred to me that it was a particularly special decade. As far as I knew, it was just the way the world had always been. I had no understanding that for the older generation there'd been a terrible depression followed by a ghastly war. And I certainly couldn't imagine life without the NHS.
July 5th, the new National Health Service starts.
But it was just getting going. And the early 50s saw a massive recruitment drive for nurses. They came from across the world, from the West Indies to Ireland. Part of an unprecedented period of immigration that bolstered both the NHS and the impoverished British economy. Mary Powell had dreamt of becoming a nurse since she was a small girl growing up in Ireland. She couldn't afford tuition fees, but in Britain, the training was free. In 1952, a week before her 18th birthday, Mary packed her things and left Ireland behind her. She flew from Dublin to Northolt Airport, just outside London, and then got a bus to Putney and her new home. This was despite furious resistance from her mother, who thought that England was some kind of ungodly hellhole. As a staunch Catholic, she was dead against Mary living in a Protestant England. From the windows of her London bus, seeing bomb damage still being repaired, Mary must have wondered whether it actually was a bit of a hellhole. She eventually arrived at the rebuilt Putney Hospital to start her 3 years of training. The NHS was amazing, offering a high level of care, but the world that Mary walked into was as regimented and as ruthless as an army, run by an all-powerful general, the matron.
I should like to see you in my office when you go off duty. Yes, matron.
Everything that Mary's matron said was law, and her loyal officers were the sisters who ran the wards. Matron behaved like some sort of colonial officer. She ruled from her office with a rod of iron. Matron's powers even extended to the nurses' private lives. It was she who decided what time they went to bed and made sure that there was no one else tucked up with them. And if a nurse ever did decide to get married, well, that was it. She had to leave the profession. It wasn't actually illegal to get married, but any nurse would first require the permission of the hospital board and, you guessed it, the matron.
No, I'm sorry.
Debbie Quinn is a practicing nurse and knows Mary's story. So she arrives on the first day. What kind of environment would she have been confronted with?
I mean, the wards that you would have trained in would have been what we call the Nightingale wards, the long wards with the table in the middle. Very, very, very strict.
Just when I thought I was really being good, Sister ticks me off for being too slow, sends me to matron. I don't like your attitude, nurse. That's mutual then, said I, because I don't like yours. You didn't. No, but one day I will.
Your first experience on the wards is very much about the cleaning, about the tidying up. It would have been a lot of cleaning bedpans, making sure the area is clean and sterile.
What would the environment that she worked in have been like?
They would have been woken up very early, between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. They would have been expected to have made their beds, get everything straight, get themselves into their uniform, which was a lot more complicated than where we are today. You know, you're talking of a dress, you're talking of cuffs, you're talking of an apron, proper hats. Hats were got rid of in the 1990s.
To begin with, trainees weren't trusted to treat real patients, but had to practice endlessly on a dummy called Araminta. This is Araminta, or should I say, one of Araminta's friends. This is a medical dummy, like Mary would have used when she was in training. This is how she would have learned about the human body, and in particular, how to administer medical procedures like giving an injection, or a bed bath, or an enema. Although it looks as though you've just had one, love. Inside her were models of all the important organs. After 3 months in the classroom, the day came for Mary to apply her learning to a living, breathing human being.
Give the man his injection. Stop fussing and get on with it,
said the sister. Sadly, the actual patient wasn't available for our filming, but the following did actually happen to a real person. Mary was terrified. She picked up the kidney-shaped dish and the syringe and gingerly moved forward. Mary had been provided with a thick antibiotic mixture that had to be injected right into his bottom. She tried to stay cool. Mr. Brown, she said, I'm just going to give you a tiny injection. Would you mind rolling over onto your side and dropping your pyjama trousers? And then, bam, she administered the injection. But it didn't go into the muscle as it was supposed to, and his bottom swelled up. Mary was in floods of tears. She thought she'd get the sack. But all the sister said was,
toughen up, pal.
Mr. Brown eventually recovered and told Mary, never mind, it could have been worse. But worse was to come. Mary also had to learn to support the consultant surgeons during operations, and found their bombastic attitude a little alarming.
Forceps.
Forceps.
Scalpel.
Scalpel.
Spleen.
Yes.
Cracking game of golf with Carruthers on Sunday. There's the gallbladder. Leg coming off.
Dirty nurse. Her first role as a student nurse in theatre was what was known as the dirty nurse. What's this expression, a dirty nurse?
In theatres, obviously, for infection control, you want to keep instruments clean, and when they're dirty, you want them to go away. You don't want them to be near a clean area. Your clean nurse would be the nurse that passes all the clean equipment to the consultant. The dirty nurse removes the dirty stuff, so the dirty swabs, the dirty instruments, possibly limbs, whatever.
No, dirty nurse, this is for you. Just coming.
Mary felt she was born to be a nurse, but it was an enormously draining job, both physically and emotionally. Mary worked a 12-hour day plus time for meals. She wasn't allowed to live outside the hospital until she'd qualified. Mary lived in a nurse's home with the other trainees in the hospital grounds. They all got on really well together, but they were paid just £10 a month, most of which they spent on what they called therapy, which meant fags and cider, and occasionally being able to save a few pennies so they could go on a girls' night out. They'd sneak back to the nurse's home long after the matron's curfew. So how did they get back in? Well, they did a deal with one of the nurses who'd stayed home that she would always leave the window open just a little bit. So you get this queue in the early hours of a Sunday morning of all these giggling, tipsy nurses all trying to get in together, back into the home. And fortunately, they usually got away with it. You'll notice I said usually. There was one occasion when they arrived back so late that the nurse on the ground floor had gone to bed. Luckily, a window in the toilets was still open. Mary was the first to squeeze in, but unfortunately, she landed right on top of a consultant who happened to be sitting there using the lav. And then, on one night out, it happened.
All right, what's your name? Brian, actually.
She met Brian, the salesman. Little did she know what a dramatic chain of events meeting Brian would trigger. Mary was crazy about Brian, and she wrote an excited letter back to Ireland to tell her sister just how much she loved him. Perhaps she'd forgotten how they'd feel back home about the very idea of seeing someone from Protestant England. One day, Mary was summoned to the matron's office, and she was astonished to find her mother and brother sitting there. Apparently, her mother had heard scandalous stories about Mary and an Englishman. So naturally, she'd rushed over to rescue her daughter and bring her back to the safety of Ireland. The problem was she could. Mary was 20, but this was the 50s, and you weren't officially an adult till you were 21. So there was nothing the matron could do to stop her mother taking her away. What a disaster. It was 1954 and Mary's final year of training. And now her dreams of becoming a nurse and a life with Brian were in tatters. Back in Ireland, Mary was confined to her room, a prisoner in her own home. Her mum kept the door locked and plied her with tablets, which made her very woozy. She tried to write to Brian, but her dad burnt her letters. Brian tried to write to her, but a friend of her dad's at the post office intercepted them. And then one day, there's a knock at the door and Brian standing there. And he says, "Can I come in?" And all hell breaks loose. Mary's mum comes rushing in and tells him to get out of here because he's a heathen swine. And Mary's going, "Why didn't you write?" And Brian's going, "I did. Why didn't you write?" And Mary's going, "I did." And then suddenly Mary's dad's there with a shotgun which is pointing right between Brian's eyes. And Mary's going, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And Brian's going, "I'm not going anywhere till Mary tells me to." And Mary thinks, "Oh no, he's going to have his face shot off. What am I going to do?" And she says, "Brian, go back to London. I never want to see you again." What a palaver. Brian left, and that would probably have been the end of it. But then something happened that would change everything. Something quite catastrophic. On December the 2nd, 1955, there was a huge train crash at Barnes in London. Mary's hospital in nearby Putney was overwhelmed with casualties. One of the senior nurses sent her a letter, and it was addressed to her parents. So they opened it, and for some reason that Mary never quite understood, they let her read it. And it was a plea for her to come back to London to help. And presumably, her mum and dad thought she wouldn't be able to do anything about it. But with the help of one of her sisters, who bought her a plane ticket, she went through the lounge window and escaped. She returned to Putney Hospital. Mary threw everything into nursing the casualties. She passed her exams and then she married Brian. But she did so in secret because nurses weren't allowed to get married. If they found out that she had, then she'd have had to leave her job and become a housewife. After all, this was the 1950s. No one did find out, and Mary kept working as a nurse until 2013, when she finally retired at the incredible age of 79 and settled down to write her autobiography. With the war well and truly behind us, the government stopped recycling metal for the war effort. But there was still a pressing need to recycle to support British industry.
There are thousands of houses all over the country with attics or lumber rooms just like this one, full of broken or discarded articles made of iron or steel, useless to the owner, but valuable as scrap when it goes to the furnaces of the country's steelworks.
So there was a niche to fill, an opportunity for the rag and bone men.
Hurry up, you lazy nag.
But they were being run ragged.
Oh, give me a break.
Reinforcements, though, were on the way. Having just returned from fighting Rommel in the desert, Manchester's John Bibby was looking for work. Apart from being a war hero, and there were plenty of those about, one thing John had in his favour was that he was as strong as an ox, and he didn't fancy working indoors, so he applied to be a tatter. In other words, he'd become a rag and bone man. It may not sound all that, what's the word, aspirational to us, but back in the 1950s, there was something of a rag and bone man renaissance going on. Why rags and bones? Well, rags and old clothes and old bedclothes had always been needed for stuffing mattresses and making carpet underlay, and bones were good for glue and fertiliser. But the problem with all that kind of stuff was it was pretty stinky and unpleasant. So what a rag and bone man like John really wanted was metal. But many of these recyclers still called themselves rag and bone men, and even inspired a TV hit. You dirty, dirty old man. When I was a kid in the early 50s, sometimes I'd be hanging around outside the house and this horse and cart and bloke would come down the street and he'd be going, "Heel-ree, heel-ree." And I had no idea what heel-ree meant until my dad later told me it was any old rags. It was the rag and bone man. And it was exactly the same with John. Every morning he would arrive at 8 o'clock sharp and pick up his cart from scrap merchants, and he'd go round Chawton and Stretford going, "Reg Boer, Reg Boer," which was, of course, rag and bones. John rented an old hand cart from Atkinson's scrapyard for 3 shillings a week, one of 17 they had. He now had to make enough money to pay for that and look after his wife and 2 kids. John was a tough, short geezer with curly hair, and he always wore a double-breasted suit. Not the most practical item of apparel, but he liked to be smart and do his job well. He also wore a trilby. Now, why did they go out of fashion? He was known as Flash John. John began his day by prowling the deserted streets of Manchester, up and down, until eventually... here we go. Nice bit of schmutter. He didn't even stop for lunch. Although sometimes he'd get a couple of pints of milk from the milkman. Cheers. Eventually, he'd find a couple of old bikes or an ironing board or whatever. To be frank, he preferred heavy iron to light steel. He made more money from it, but he was never picky, because if you were, it might undermine customer relations. More coats and some shoes. He just kept going all day until his cart looked full. Well, that would have been enough for most people, but not for John. Besides, he just had a tip-off. The people at number 4 were having a clear-out. A reporter in the Manchester Guardian recorded John collecting an old gas stove and what seemed to be the greater part of a motor car, a wireless, a dining room chair, a mattress and a settee. Now do it! Ugh. Next, he just had to wheel it all back to the scrapyard. John returned to the yard at nightfall. All the stuff was weighed up. He got £1 for the sofa and £1 for everything else. Total, £2. Which was actually about the average wage for the time. At last, John's gruelling 12-hour shift was done, and he returned home to his tiny flat above a shop. and to the person he called the best wife in the world. He'd be ready to go again in the morning. Maybe have a bit more luck next time. What a man. I don't think the Nazis stood a chance against someone like Flash John. The end of the war saw 3 million men return to Britain looking to resume their lives, which meant that the women who had taken traditionally men's work were now expected to step aside, sweetened by the promise of a brave new future in the kitchen. A bit like those glamorous Americans. America was leading the consumer boom, and Brits wanted some of it. But the reality was harder for the ordinary family. Rationing was still in place until 1954. Money was tight. From some of the films at the time, you'd think that the 50s was a great step forward for women in terms of domestic technology. But was it really? Not if you were a working-class woman like Doreen Turner. Here she is, getting married to Ron in 1948. Having fought at Dunkirk, Normandy and Arnhem, Doreen's husband slotted back into a career making tractors. Doreen, though, had to jack her job in and think about homemaking instead. Unusually for a working-class couple, Ron and Doreen shelled out to get their own place. They had a nice terraced house in Nuneaton, 3 bedrooms, one for Ron and Doreen, one for all the boys, and the other for all the girls. But they were very short of money, so they had a lodger. And he slept downstairs in the front room. The house still had an outside loo and coal fires, but no heating at all in the bedrooms. Historian Dr. Ray Ritchie can fill me in on 1950s women's lifestyles. She also happens to be Doreen's great niece. Is this kitchen like the one that she would have done all her work in?
It's probably a lot more colourful than the one she'd have done her work in. So you may have had like one cabinet like this, but actually a lot of it would have been from a much earlier period because not everybody in the 50s had a 1950s kitchen. But people started to add things. So you might have started with an electric iron and then maybe a twin tub, but not an automatic washing machine. So that still involved quite a lot of labour, not as much as a dolly and a mangle would have done, but, you know, still quite a lot of work.
Doreen didn't even have a twin tub, let alone a fancy refrigerator. The meat was stored in the pantry meat safe. Food went off really quickly, so she'd have to go shopping every day. Ron's wages only covered the essentials, so the catch was, if Doreen wanted all the latest labour-saving appliances, she'd need to work twice as hard and get a job. See that Debenhams? It used to be J.C. Smith's, and that was the biggest department store in Nuneaton in the 1950s, and it's where Doreen worked. It was like a 50s fantasy. Ground floor, food hall, washing machines and cooking appliances. First floor, clothes in all the latest fashions. To entice consumers to part with their cash, a new concept was introduced, buying on credit. Now nothing was beyond reach. Now go on, you know you want to. Doreen struggled. But she was determined to juggle her job with looking after 5 kids, so they could enjoy the fruits of the 50s too. As a kid, my whole life was about reading. Puffin books, the heirloom library, and toys. Fuzzy Felt, Meccano, the magic robot which span round and round and you asked it a question and it pointed at the answer. Absolutely brilliant. Seemed like there was a new toy on the market every week. But the pressure on Doreen must have been immense to buy at least some of these things for their kids. I mean, who wouldn't want I Spy sports cars? The dream for Doreen's family was to get just one of the magical consumer items that were constantly being advertised. Eventually, they felt sufficiently well off to be able to afford to rent a brand new machine which would transform their lives. Not a shiny washing machine one of those. A telly. I wonder what's on. Doreen and her family joined the mushrooming TV audience who enjoyed just one channel, with 21 million tuning in to watch the Queen's coronation.
Amazing.
I could watch it all day. Be better when there's a picture. But the new contraption did nothing to help Doreen in the kitchen.
So sometimes a family might decide to go for a television when they didn't have a washing machine, which to us might seem, well, like the wrong way around, but it was about family entertainment. You could all sit around a TV at night and enjoy that.
If Doreen had any time left after finishing all her chores, that is. With 5 young children to look after, it was no easy feat. Housework was often a thankless task, but Doreen took pride in her career, something she found especially rewarding.
Doreen was considered unusual in her commitment to her job, that she really enjoyed it and it was part of her life that she valued, rather than it just being a means to an end that she wanted to earn some money.
Look at this fantastic crockery. We used to have exactly the same stuff at home. It actually celebrates all the new things that people could buy. Look, there's a coffee table and a cheese knife and a nice new sofa. But for Doreen, it wasn't really all these things that she could either buy or at least hope to buy, all this marvellous new stuff. It was the new friendships that she could make and the places that she could go to. In the 1950s, manufacturers retooled to supply the increasing demand from ordinary Brits hungry for American-style luxury. Leading the way was American giant Ford, which transformed its Dagenham factory into the biggest in Europe, employing 50,000 workers to make 1 in 3 cars sold in Britain. Roy Nightingale was thrilled to get a job there. During the war, Roy was captured by the Germans and forced to work in a Nazi labour camp as a miner. He had to work really hard, otherwise he'd have been shot. So the idea of working here at Ford's must have been a dream. Roy lived with his family in a flat in a rundown 4-storey house in New Cross, South London, one of the poorest parts of the city. Daughter Jean was a child at the time.
There was one loo on the ground floor, and that had to service all 4 levels, and a lot of the rooms rented out were to, you know, people like the railway workers, and they would go out on the lash on a Saturday night, and of course on the Sunday morning it was like pretty horrendous, and Mum used to have to clean it all up.
The Ford factory was a miracle of manufacturing. Iron ore went in at one end, shiny new cars were dispatched from its own docks at the other. Roy's first job was in the foundry, casting engine blocks from massive lumps of iron. The engine block is at the centre of the engine, where the petrol's ignited in its cylinders. If he thought this was going to be easy, he had another think coming. It was less of the American dream and more like a living nightmare. Working in temperatures of 50 degrees while inhaling thick metallic dust, Roy and the team could only work for 30 minutes at a time. Your dad's work was pretty tough, wasn't it?
Yeah, and because of his experience in the war, he didn't mind the graft. It was to provide for the family, so he was happy to do that. He took 1 day off when he was really ill with flu. That was the only day he ever took off. He was religious, he used to get there early, he would be the last to leave, but he also had a great sense of humour, so he was never, like, miserable or grouchy. But yes, the work was hard.
Apart from the heat, it was ear-splittingly loud and very, very dirty. Roy's overalls would get so filthy that it would take his wife Rose 2 days of scrubbing and wringing them in a wash tub like this, which of course made her hands all chapped and cracked, just to get them ready for work again. But Roy never really saw his pay packet. What was this business about the pay packet on paydays?
Mum always went down to Ford's Friday lunchtimes to pick up Dad's wages, which was always paid in cash.
Yeah.
Because she didn't trust my dad, because the men would often spend it in the pubs or down the bookies. She knew by then, keeping hold of the cash, that it would go on the right things, i.e. food and rent and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
you know. But I think it was standard practice.
Roy survived the foundry and got a job on the production line. On the plus side, he could breathe the air without putting his life in danger. On the downside, working on the production line was mind-numbingly dull. Roy had to learn to work like a robot, doing exactly the same set of actions time and time and time again. So first, he'd have to go and pick up his components, which would take him 10 seconds, and then he would walk back with them to the car, another 10 seconds, get ready, 5 seconds, execute the job, ba-dum, 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 1 minute, 5 seconds, ready to start the whole thing all over again and again and again and again, remorselessly for 8 hours. To get them through the day, the men would daydream.
Smithies on the ball.
Some relived entire football matches.
And scores.
Roy preferred to escape to his beloved garden. He just had to keep going till the next break. They had 2 half-hour breaks, and the toilet breaks were strictly supervised by the foreman. You had 2 minutes, absolutely not anymore. If you went on any longer, the foreman would look at his watch and then he'd issue you with a warning. And this was the result. The Ford Consul, one of the great Fords of the 1950s. Isn't it absolutely gorgeous? Look at those lines. It's quite likely that Roy was actually involved in making this very car. He didn't have one himself. He had a Ford Popular, which was a bit cheaper, but he was very proud of it. Cheaper car ownership transformed weekends. No longer reliant on public transport, Brits enjoyed family day trips. Ford's allure was delivering the American dream on a budget for cash-strapped Brits. There was something for everyone, from the flashy Consul to cheaper family cars such as Roy's Popular and this 50s Anglia. A classy number. Yay! 0 to 50 in 24 seconds. What a car. Oh, I'm getting a lot of admiring looks. Oh, really soft brakes. Takes ages to stop it. Oh, it's like turning a tractor. One feature about this car is that the windscreen wipers go faster the slower the car goes. And if you wanted a heater, you had to pay extra. Lovely motor. I'd forgotten how underpowered these cars were compared with ours. The acceleration is like duk, 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 duk. And now, Roy's whole family was going places. Life changed for Roy's family thanks to one of the specially designed new towns. It was to be the largest government housing project of the century. 8 new towns built to solve the chronic housing shortage. This one was Basildon in Essex, very handy for Dagenham. They now had a whole house all to themselves. What was that like?
Beautiful. I remember getting off the train and the first thing that hit you is the air and also the green and cows. And I remember thinking, wow. And the house that we got, lavatory, bathroom, hot and cold running water, it was marvellous.
Roy continued to work in nearby Dagenham till his retirement. Your dad worked at Ford's for over 30 years, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he was given a clock. Yeah.
What sort of clock?
It's one of these carriage clocks, you know. I felt aggrieved at the time because I felt he should have got a car because that was the least he deserved. You know, they're very lucky to have him.
The 1950s saw Britain's place in the world change dramatically as its remaining empire began to disintegrate. But 3.5 million of the empire's subjects had fought in the war for what they called the mother country and still felt close to Britain. One of them was Alan Wilmot, who served in the RAF. But his job didn't involve flying planes. He used a boat to rescue airmen who ditched into the English Channel.
There's the British Spitfire.
Which was actually a very dangerous job because search and rescue teams were often targeted by German warplanes. Having constantly put his life at risk, survived the war and played his part in the downfall of Nazi Germany, Alan was demobbed and returned home, all the way back to Jamaica. Alan's great passion was music, and he was a fine singer, but it didn't make him a living. Even though he was well educated, opportunities were few and far between, as Jamaica was still a British colony, and the top jobs were taken by white men. So Alan decided to risk everything and return to Britain. Second time round, though, things couldn't have been more different. People would come up to him and say, "Oi, what are you still doing here? Don't you know the war's over?" He suddenly found that his relationship with the people of this country had really changed. Now on Civvy Street, despite the large number of vacancies, Alan found that being black made it extremely difficult to get work. Back then, it was perfectly legal to refuse people work because of their ethnicity. Alan couldn't even find anywhere to stay. Landlords really did put up signs saying, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." This, of course, would be illegal today. That kind of attitude makes you wonder what some Brits thought they'd been fighting Hitler for in the first place. Alan was so desperate for somewhere to stay that he'd catch the last underground train and sleep in a carriage overnight. All rooms have an excellent view of Hounslow sidings. There is no minibar available. Then he'd travel back the next day to continue his slog in search of work. Welcome to Waterloo Station. Washing facilities are conveniently located in the gents. When he did eventually find work, it was menial jobs. In the evenings, he began to sing in the new Caribbean music clubs in London and started dreaming of a career in music.
Music and entertainment, to a certain extent, offered solace from what you would experience on the streets every day. Kevin Legendre is an expert in black music. The first black music I remember as a kid on the radio was calypso. It's really important. It's the heart and soul of the Caribbean to a certain extent because it gives people an opportunity to tell stories about their daily lives. But also, it's not just about what happens in the West Indies. You can write calypsos about the royals in the UK, and you can write calypsos about coming to the UK. Do we know whether Alan sang or wrote calypsos? I don't know whether he wrote calypsos, but he certainly got involved with a great calypso singer from Trinidad, who's Edric Connor. Edric Connor, Lord Kitchener, and a number of Caribbeans were part of the growing West Indian music scene. And that was where Alan wanted to be. So, with his brother Harold and a Jamaican friend, they formed a band called the Ken Hunter Trio. They're actually pretty good. They went on tour, played various clubs, but they didn't make much money. It beat sleeping rough on the tube, but he was restless. Alan felt he was destined for something bigger, and then the opportunity came. He and his brother got the call to come down to the recording studio and put the backing vocals on a record. The call had come from Edric Connor. Their recording went so well that they formed a vocal group called the Southlanders. Oh, sorry, this is probably a 45. Chipmunk remix. It is, isn't it? And their popularity began to take off. Put the needle on the record. I think I remember the song. They were to have a string of hits, including Alone, Mole in a Hole, and Put a Light in the Window.
There's a house on the corner
It's actually incredibly commercial, isn't it? Well, we've been talking about like the ethnicity of calypso and all that, but this is a 3-minute single for a mass market.
Yeah, and it's basically something which shows just how influenced they were by American models.
Those
like
doo-wop type harmonies.
rhythm and blues, doo-wop. This is something that would have been part of their basic vocabulary.
Gonna climb them stairs, gonna ring them bells. Before I lose my nerves, I gotta ring.
Is that Alan, that solo voice?
I think so, but the interesting thing is that you hear how the Caribbean identity comes through at that point, because he's not saying ring those bells, he's saying ring them bells. His accent is unmistakable.
The Southlanders were also a great live act and were soon supporting stars such as Cliff Richard and Shirley Bassey. While they were successful, were they making a lot of money?
If you're talking about having that status in society and being accepted by the mainstream, then no.
But he did have an E-Type.
He did have an E-Type Jag, and I believe that he was stopped by the police for driving his E-Type Jag, which again reminds us of the perils of being black at that point in time. But I think the other part of that story, which is quite funny, is that when it became clear that he was a singer and an entertainer of note, one of the officers asked for an autograph. So you never know when
show business, yeah.
when fame is going to catch up with you. Yeah. And that in itself is a very important thing. It's like you can have status as an entertainer, but when it comes to civilian life, doing something basic like getting a mortgage, no, it didn't happen.
What happened after that?
So the Southlanders, they kept going until the early 60s and then they broke up.
Oh, tragic. It's worse than the Beatles splitting up.
Well, the Beatles were one of the reasons why the Southlanders probably split up, because the arrival of the Beatles and the Stones and the whole rock and pop movement basically did for those groups who were very successful in the 50s.
But Alan had had a blast, especially after such a difficult start. He did eventually even manage to get a mortgage through a Caribbean support group. And in 1964, he married Joyce, a nurse, also from the West Indies. After the breakup of the Southlanders, Alan eventually left the music business and returned to something a bit more steady, if not nearly as exciting. A telephone operator with the post office. Alan's is a wonderful story of heroism and optimism and ambition against all the odds. Amazing to think how many people his music must have cheered up during the 1950s. I rather think quite a lot of them would have needed it.